I would like to introduce to you our speaker, Wesley Huff. And he was born in Pakistan and spent much of his childhood in the Middle East. And he received his bachelor in sociology at York and master's of theological studies at Tyndale, and is currently a PhD student in New Testament at the University of Toronto. He loves to focus on interfaith dialogues between Islam and Christianity, and he now resides in Toronto with his wife and their son. But before we engage in this talk, we're going to watch a student story.
Well, thank you for coming out. As was mentioned, my name's Wesley. I'm a student here at Wycliffe, and I work for Power to Change Ministries, which is one of the partners in this event. And what I want to talk about is one of my favorite topics of the Bible, and specifically the topic, why trust the Bible? Now, before I want to jump into that, I want us to define the terms, because there's all sorts of different ways that we can talk about trust. And in particular, with a document like the Bible, we need to be clear what we're talking about. And so, from just a definitional perspective, if we're talking about trust, it's defined as a firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. And that's what I'm going to use as my criteria in terms of, can we trust the Bible? I'm going to be talking about truth, I'm going to be talking about reliability, and I'm going to be talking about ability and strength. But it also begs the question, what do I mean when I say the Bible? Because sometimes we talk about the Bible in very broad terms, sometimes in unhelpful ways. Because you see, the Bible isn't one book as much as it's 66 books. It was written over a course of 1,600 years on 3 different continents by approximately 40 different authors in 3 different languages, 2 major languages, Greek and Hebrew, and 1 minor language, Aramaic. So it's not a book as much as it's a collection of books written over a long period of time by different authors, all focusing on different topics, but focusing on this question of why we're here, what we're doing, and really, how do we get out of here? And so if we go by our criteria, if we go by the first one, reliability, how do we put our trust in the Bible in terms of reliability? Well, you may have heard of the Bible described as the telephone game. This is a common analogy. It's used by comedians, it's used by lay people, it's even used by the occasional scholar. And the telephone game is a game that's designed to break the message passed on from one person to the other in a bit of a comedic way. And this is the way it's described, that these messages are sort of lost. It's kind of like this. You have a soldier, and he's on the battlefield, and he's been shot, and he's communicating to someone else. He's saying, I'm not going to make it. Tell my wife I love her. But just as the other soldier promises, he himself gets shot. And so with his last dying breath, he crawls along to another soldier, and he says, you have to tell Jim's wife that he loves her. Well, eventually, when he gets to Jim's wife and communicates it, she says, what do you mean Jim rubs birds? You see, the message, it's easy for it to get lost. And sometimes this is the way we imagine the communication of messages. In fact, the illustration of the telephone game, you hearing the first message and then you whispering into the next person's ears and the next, and next, and next, and next, and next, till at the last person we get a jumbled up message, is not actually an accurate way that describes the Bible. If for no other reason, then it is a single line of transmission. What do I mean by that? Well, it's one person communicating to one person. And actually, there are rules to the telephone game. You have to whisper. You aren't allowed to say it twice. There are rules that are actually designed to corrupt the message. But when we look at the Bible, and what I'm going to be focusing on in particular is the New Testament, the last 27 books of the Bible, the stories that focus on the life and times of Jesus, what we get is not a single line of transmission, but multiple lines of transmission. In fact, these are written in different times, at different places, by different authors in multiple locations. And they're copied over the centuries multiple times. In fact, between the 1st century and the 4th century, hundreds, if not thousands of copies of these books that we refer to as the New Testament were spread throughout the ancient world. And what that meant is that over a very short period of time, we have copies and copies and copies and copies of the New Testament all over the ancient world. Which begs the question, how many of these copies survive today? Well, if we're just looking at what the New Testament was originally written in Greek, we have approximately 6,000 copies, that's everything from the 2nd century to the 16th century, of those New Testament writings. If you just get rid of the Greek manuscripts, we have approximately 10,000 of the Latin manuscripts. Once again, everything from the 2nd century to the 17th century, the 1600s. And then if you add all of the other ancient translations, the Sahidic, the Bohairic, the Coptic, the Old Church Slavonic, and you add those all into a pile, you have a pile that's approximately 24,000 strong. We have a lot of these manuscripts. Now, how does this communicate reliability? Well, I would argue, unlike the telephone game, what we have with the Bible is more like a puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle, a 100,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. Now, when you copy things, especially handwritten copies, the downside of that is that scribes and copyists make mistakes. And we do have minor mistakes and occasional major mistakes within the New Testament tradition. And so what you get with the New Testament in terms of its reliability is, because it's like a puzzle, a 100,000-piece puzzle, we need to ask ourselves the question, would it be better to have a 100,000-piece puzzle that you opened up and found that there were 90,000 pieces, meaning that you were missing 10,000 pieces, or you opened it up and found that there were 110,000 pieces? You had 10,000 too many pieces. Well, what we're dealing with the Bible and the New Testament in particular is a 100,000-piece puzzle with 110,000 pieces. We have more pieces than are necessary. But the benefit of that is that when you put the puzzle together, you start to see where the pieces don't belong. You see, the strength of having so many copies is that once you start to compare the copies, you can see that in your puzzle, one piece from another puzzle is, as someone's come along and they've tried to make it fit, or extra pieces are piled on top of each other. It's easier to see than you think once you start to put the puzzle together where the pieces just simply don't belong. It's the strength of the New Testament in terms of its reliability that we have so many copies. Now, what about this aspect of truth? Because what I've just contended for is what's referred to as transmission. That what we have now is what the original authors wrote back then. But you can have an accurately transmitted document which doesn't actually communicate internal truth. They could have lied. They could have made things up later on. How do we test that? Well, that's an internal argument in terms of going into truth. Now, I want to illustrate this in a specific way in terms of communicating to you context, because the discussion of truth in this, specifically when we're talking about context, is important. The other day, I was at the gas station and I was filling up my car, and there was someone on the other pump behind me who made this comment. They said to the other person they were with, "Remember when air was free? Now it's $1.50. And I thought, remember when air was free? It's $1.50. Who on earth is charging for air? That makes absolutely no sense. Until I looked over and I realized they were talking about a pump, an air pump to fill up your tires. Now, without that context, the statement made absolutely no sense. Now, do you know why air costs so much nowadays? It's because of inflation. Okay, no more puns at Relevant Week. Got it. So, what I want to show you was actually a study that was done a number of years ago that looked at the most popular names in ancient Palestine within a specific time period in antiquity. And what they did is they looked at the most popular names in the New Testament, they looked at the most popular names in Josephus, they looked at the most popular names in these ossuaries, which are these Jewish bone boxes, which they would carve the name on the outside of the bone boxes, and the most popular names in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And as they looked at these, a few different scholars got the wise idea that taking these names, and specifically those from a time period closer to that of Jesus, they said, can we look at these names and pinpoint the accuracy, the trustworthiness of the New Testament as something that was written in the time frame that it claims to be written in. Because here's the thing. If you were asked to write a story and pass it off as authentic from 17th century France in Paris, what's the likelihood that you would get the names of the people, particularly the names that were popular in 17th century France in a specific window, correct? I mean, you might get a few. We know a few French names. We know like Pierre and we know French names, but what are the chances we would get them correct for that time period? The popularity of names change over time. And so what they did is they looked at some of these names within a smaller window than the original study, and they looked at places like the Gospel of Matthew, that biography of Jesus' life written by Matthew, at places where names were listed. In chapter 10 of Matthew's biography, it names the disciples. Simon Peter, Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and so on and so on. And what they did is they looked at this list of cross-referenced most popular names, and then they looked at names of people in lists like this, and they concentrated on what are referred to as qualifiers. If you have a group of people and they all have the same name, you have to differentiate them, right? When I was growing up, we had lots of Sarahs and lots of Michaels. So there was tall Sarah and short Sarah. There was, Michael with the big nose. We made all sorts of qualifiers for those people. And this is what we do when names are popular. So if you look at someone like Simon, Simon is the #1 most popular names in all of those cross-reference sources. And we have a qualifier, particularly in this. James, number 11 most popular. He's the son of Zebedee. You have a qualifier. John, the 5th most popular, who is James's brother. But then you have Philip, no qualifier, and it's number 61. Why? It's not that popular of a name within this time period. Bartholomew, another not popular name, no qualifier. You have Matthew, number 9, the tax collector. You have James, once again, number 11, the son of Alphaeus. You have Thaddeus, number 39, no qualifier, wouldn't have been as popular. You have Simon again, the Canaanite, number 1, there's a qualifier. You have Judas, number 3, Iscariot who betrayed Jesus. The most popular names line up and have qualifiers in terms of the ones that are most frequently cited in these first century documents that refer to these people. Now, names are some of the hardest things to get right. I am terrible at remembering names. Why? Because it's very hard to look at someone and have their name associated with them because they could be named anything. Now, names are some of the hardest things to get right, and yet in the New Testament in particular, and in the Gospels, the story of Jesus' life in particular, they get these things right. Now, if they get what are some of the hardest things right, is it that much of a stretch to say they get some of the easier things to remember right? I don't think so. I think it actually points towards truthfulness. Here's another way I want to show you. What are referred to as undesigned coincidences. These are instances when you have one or more independent historical accounts, and they interlock in such a way that would be unexpected if the story were simply fabricated wholesale. So let me give you a specific example of this. In John's Gospel his biography of Jesus' life, you have the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And he records, he says, lifting his eyes up, talking about Jesus, then, and seeing a large crowd was coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" Now, there's an interesting question at hand here. Why does Jesus ask Philip? Because Philip is actually a rather unconsequential character in this whole story. There are more likely candidates for Jesus to ask. He could have asked Matthew, who was a tax collector, who would have been used to financial transactions. He could have asked Judas, who was labeled as the in charge of the money bag. Why does he ask Philip? Well, what we can do is we can look at other instances where the feeding of the 5,000 is told. Specifically, Luke also tells the same story. He says, on their return, the apostles told him all that they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. When the crowds learned it, they followed him and welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who were in need of healing. Well, Luke doesn't mention individuals like Philip, but what he does tell us is he tells us the where. We have the who, and Luke tells us the where. So now we have the key actors in question, and we have the location. Well, it's interesting, if you go back to John, he mentions that Philip is actually from Bethsaida. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida. So it begs the question, why did Jesus turn to Philip and ask where to buy bread? Well, Philip was a local. He would have known where to buy bread. So we put the pieces together. Because John and Luke tell the same story. Now, Luke doesn't mention Philip, but he does tell us the location. John, on the other hand, does mention Philip, but he doesn't mention the location. But he does tell us that Philip is from that location. So when Jesus asks, where shall we buy bread in the feeding of the 5,000, he does so because Philip is the likely candidate. But we only get those gaps filled because of undesigned coincidences. When we read the Gospels together, we find that they fill out these details, which are otherwise inconsequential, but when they tell similar stories, they actually start to confirm each other in very interesting ways. This is what scholars refer to as verisimilitude. That means the appearance of truth, likelihood, and probability. When we look at things like the frequency of names and the fact that we can trace them to a particular time period, or undesigned coincidences, we see that they have the appearance of truth, likelihood, and probability, which comes back to our definition. Ability and strength. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is the fact that there are all sorts of people who look at the New Testament documents, and in particular the life of Jesus, and they say he's communicating something that I feel like I need to put my ability and strength in. This is something that speaks to me in a way, and I can look at it, and it shows to be trustworthy, and so I desire to put my ability and strength into it. Now, the whole gospel, which is a word that you may or may not have heard, comes from a Greek word that means good news. It's used frequently in the New Testament. The gospel message, the good news of Jesus, comes down to a particular question that Jesus asks his disciples almost in the middle of Mark's biography of his life, when Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And that's the question that the Bible as a whole is pointing to. Who do we say that Jesus is? Because my biggest regret this afternoon would be that if you walked out of this room and simply believed that the New Testament was a collection of trustworthy, reliable historical documents. That would be my biggest regret. Why? Because this question, who do you say that I am, that Jesus asks, is a question that we need to ask ourselves. Who do we say Jesus is? Because here's the reality. If we look at what Jesus said, particularly about himself, he made some pretty audacious claims. He, during his lifetime, made some pretty grand claims to be God himself. And then he predicted his life. In his life, he predicted his death and resurrection, and then he did it. Which is why Andy Bannister and Relevant alum says people who rise from the dead have more credibility than people who don't rise from the dead. You can trust the Bible. I would contend to you that in this short time, what I would like you to remember is that it is historically reliable in terms of the fact that what was written back then is what you have now. And it is trustworthy in its internal coherence, in how we evaluate trustworthiness. But we need to ask the question, who is this Jesus guy? Because that's what the Bible is really pointing to. Philosopher and theologian C.S. Lewis said, "Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, is of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. This is a big question. Why? Because if the Bible is trustworthy, it means something for how we treat and what we do with Jesus. So why trust the Bible? Well, I would contend to you, it's because it's reliable, it's because it's truthful, it merits that you put your strength and ability in it, but not only that, ultimately, it is relevant. Thank you.